right, so here we go. We're going to talk about creating an RFP. This is one of those things that is it's not something you're going to run into often, if ever, if you're a junior and probably even as a mid-level type person. This is something that's usually going to be more at a senior level, maybe a manager, actually sometimes even above that, or some, this kind of thing. If you're pretty good at creating, running through an RFP process and doing that, it tends to be sort of like the higher dollar consulting skills as well. And it's actually something that part of the reason I wanted to present on this is that it seems like it's not, and maybe it's like a lost art, I guess, for lack of a better term, but it's one of those things that there's some people that do it and do it very well, but then there's a lot of RFP documents and processes out there that are just sort of, I guess, Mickey Mouse, not to, besmirch Disney at all, but it's just something that doesn't quite fit the import of it, particularly when you consider sometimes, and I guess two problems with that is, one, sometimes this RFP, you're putting an RFP together for a product that's going to, potentially you're going to spend millions or tens of millions on a product. And I've seen RFP processes that are pretty thin for those. But then even on the other end, if you're a small company that has a budget of, let's say $50,000 a year, and you're putting an RFP together for even something that's only going to be, $10,000 or $15,000, that's still a sizable chunk of your budget. So, I think I think we undervalue it and underestimate it at times. So we're going to really fly through this a little bit and do some high level 50,000 foot view, but we're going to talk about what an RFP is. And the question there I have, is it more than a document? Well, the answer is yes. We're going to talk about really the RFP process. I'm going to focus on the document itself in the bulk of this presentation, but the process around it is a lot of what this conversation is going to be, because although the document is very critical and very key, because that is the view that people, vendors have into your process and into your company, and it helps you sell whatever the recommendation is that comes out of the RFP process. The process itself is actually very important to that as well, to make sure that when you're done, that you've done your due diligence, really, so that you have picked a useful vendor or solution. And of course, with that, we're going to look at some of those key pieces of the process. So starting out with the definition, I just did the easy thing and went to Wikipedia. RFP is a request for proposal. It's a document that solicits proposal, often made through a bidding process by an agency or company interested in procurement of a commodity, service, or valuable asset to potential suppliers to submit business proposals. There's a lot of big words in that. It's very businessy, which I guess RFPs often are. But at the end of the day, what an RFP is simplified is, hey, I've got a problem. I know there's some people out there that can solve it, so I'm going to go send out to them the problem definition and say, hey, tell me what it would take for you to solve it. It's sort of the simplest thing. Give me a bid. I'm simplifying it quite a bit, but at its core, that's really what it is. I've got a problem. Tell me what your solution is, and make a pitch to sell me your solution. Now, we can talk about an RFP document, which there is, but there's also the process. As I talked about, that's really what we're going to cover a little bit more here. We're not going to focus entirely on the document. The process itself includes all of the things around actually sort of driving that document and making that document, taking advantage of that document, using it when you're done. So this starts with defining a problem, asking for proposals. So what are your solutions? Vetting the respondents, their response, the respondents themselves, and then essentially scoring, grading, or comparing the solutions that you receive back, and you pick a solution. Select the one that you want to go forward with. With this, I do want to say that the RFP process is the first step. An RFP process is not necessarily going to, when you're done with it, you're going to have a selection. You may have a time frame. You should have, at the very least, in a general sense, you should have a time frame. You should have costs, at least estimated costs. But you may or may not have key milestones. You may not necessarily even know who all the resources assigned to the solution are, because it's not really, this is not the implementation side of it. So although you may get implementation details and may even request them, because those may be critical in making your selection about the solution, you don't necessarily have to get something to that level. So it's one of those things that RFP process, like a lot of things in business, it varies from case to case as far as how detailed it needs to be, and how you may focus or highlight certain areas and maybe not so much other areas within the process. So, the very basic, if you picture's worth 1,000 words kind of thing, is all of these things go into the RFP process. You've got some bidding, you've got selecting, you've got suppliers are out there. There's some preliminary work done. There may be some procurement going in there to actually get some of that information back, and of course, then there's the business proposals that have come in. And these things may or may not be, as I said, may or may not be critical points of any given RFP process that you're going through or creating. For example, an RFP process to get, let's say you send an RFP process out to get a web hosting, you just want to do very simple web hosting company, and you send out an RFP because you want to get, and maybe you want a little bit of work done. Usually something that's as simple as, I could go with GoDaddy or Bluehost or build my own at Amazon or whatever. If it's something that simple, you're probably not going to have an RFP for it. But if you think at the very low end like that, something that would be pretty simple, you're not going to have as complex a process as somebody that wants that puts an RFP out for putting a man on the moon, or something that could be very large and complex like that. Likewise, RFP documents themselves can be pretty simple. It can be, maybe a page or two, or they can literally be like small books in themselves of, dozens or, potentially even hundreds of pages, depending on what you have into there. Which takes us right into creating the document itself. So since this is like the central point of the process, we need to talk about that a little bit. First thing you want to do within your document is provide some background. You're putting this problem out to these people, to these vendors, to these providers. Give them a little idea besides the problem, which is that next bullet point there. Obviously, you need to define the problem enough for them to provide a worthwhile solution. But you also want to give some background, give some context to that problem, and what that's going to, hopefully, with defining the problem, and when you get into talking about some of your requirements and some of the constraints, you're going to be able to provide enough information for the respondents to be able to really give you a good proposal, something that has some like hard numbers and estimates to it, and not just sort of vague ballpark kind of stuff. Well, in order to do that, it will help them immensely to have that context of what who you are, who your company is, what kind of industry are they in, what's the size of the company, as far as both internally and externally. So like sales, what kind of sales numbers do you have internally? Is it you have 5 employees? Do you have 5 million employees? Those kinds of things. Those are your background. Then you go in, you got to define the problem, providing requirements and constraints. So you need to define the problem. Typically, is not going to be like a 1-sentence definition of a problem. It's probably going to be, at least a paragraph or two, and sometimes it can be, pretty lengthy. You could have pages and pages of requirements and constraints. In particular, when you think of things like, you may or may not, depending on how you want to do it, you may have some budgetary constraints that you want to put into that. You may want to, you have some regulations or things like that, that you, some compliance issues, maybe some risk issues, security issues, and things of that nature that are, hopefully, have come out as part of defining the problem and providing the background. But, there may be those additional things in there that's like, well, this is pretty important. It's like, for example, looking at that hosting example, hosting a website is pretty straightforward. But if you say, I want to host a website where, by the way, I'm going to have people registering and they're going to be giving me credit card numbers and personal healthcare information, well, you just change that game dramatically. So, when you're putting your requirements and constraints in, you need to make sure that all of those key pieces are included. And then include the nice to haves and the secondary considerations. I mean, you're putting it out there and saying, give me your best bet. Give me a good bid for you to, come to me and me to, give you business. So with this, there's the hard requirements of this is what it's got to do. But if you can provide a little bit of essentially like hints or suggestions of, hey, by the way, here's some additional things that would prove of value to us, then that gives some more opportunity for you to be sold to, for the respondents to come in and give you some information that can really help flesh out what the proposal is, other than simply, yes, we're going to solve your problem. It gives them a little more idea of, not only are we going to solve your problem, we're going to solve it in this way that you're really going to like. And for some reason, I got that slide a second time. It's that important. So for responses, and this is still within the document, you'd want to lay out for them some sort of at least give them an idea of what you expect in response, preferably some sort of format or outline, or even some requirements of the responses. It's things like, we expect you to respond with, maybe like timeframes, the platforms you're going to use, the technologies you're going to use, any kind of architectural decisions it's going to require, any third-party vendors or tools that are going to be required to do this, including any additional licenses that we may or may not have to purchase. Things like that can all be part of your requirements for the response. You don't have to leave this wide open. It's not just, hey, send me a response. You can say, send me a response and I expect it to be in this particular format. And you can be as hard or soft as you want on that. For you, in creating the RFP, the tighter you have that response format, the easier it's going to be for you to compare apples to apples. If you have a wide open response format, that means you're going to have to dig through a whole bunch of stuff in every one of those responses to be able, to get the scoring information you're going to use when you actually are trying to make a selection. So, if you can provide something that's like a template or boilerplate or something that they just are sort of like filling in the blanks with their information, that's going to help them out a lot. It's going to make it quicker for them to be able to respond to you and easier for you to compare responses. In your RFP, make sure that you do include timelines and target dates so they have an expectation of, when do I need to get this back to you? In my experience, there's probably less than 50% of respondents I've dealt with tend to get that RFP response like the day before or the day of the deadline. So if I say I want this by March 15th, at least half of the responses are going to come back on March 14th or March 15th. That's just sort of the way it is. And by response, I mean like final, they've filled out the RFP. Now, usually what will happen in those cases, particularly for any sizable RFP, if this is anything that's going to have any reasonable amount of work for them, and usually what they're going to do is they're going to give me a response back, usually within a day or two. Now, part of that is also because if I'm going to send an RFP, I usually say, hey, here's, March 15th is the deadline, but I expect to hear back from you by March 10th if you're going to if you want to be a part of the process, because I want to make sure that I have an idea of what kind of numbers am I dealing with responses. I want to make sure that I've given you an opportunity as a provider to talk to me to make sure that there's, any questions you have are clarified so that you can give, an RFP that really makes the most sense, as opposed to one that has maybe a lot of open-ended or items or questions for me to answer before we can actually really nail down the RFP. So provide timelines and target dates. We're going to actually look at one here in a little bit. I'm going to actually flip out to an example and show some of the details of these, at least where I've gone. And I've had, like I said, I've had a lot of compliments about mine that it's considered to be very thorough, but I think there's also more that could be done on a lot of these. So we'll consider what I'm providing as a it's good enough, kind of solution. with your RFP, don't be afraid to ask about the vendor as well as their solution. So it's not just what's your software that you're providing for me or what are the resources you're going to give me, but tell me about your background. Who are you? You know, how long have you been in business? What kind of business are you? How big are you? What's your average sales? How many customers do you have? How many employees do you have? What kind of ratings do you have? Are you a publicly traded company? Have you recently been acquired? Are you in the process of acquiring companies? All sorts of things that in a business can make a break a decision, because you can look at it and say, oh, because of A, B, and C, this company's not going to be around in 6 months, or because of A, B, and C, this company will never leave the place of the planet. They will always exist because they are too big to fail. Along with the sort of continuing into the details of the response items that we're looking for from the vendors. Of course, the first thing you're going to want, or one of the critical things is, well, give me a solution. I've given you a problem. You need to give me a solution. But in order to really compare solutions, now you have to look at some other things. Obviously, price is going to matter, but don't be afraid to ask for a time frame, schedule, costs. They may not have all of that, but the more they can provide, the better. And they should at least be able to give you, if not details, they should be able to give you rough numbers of, we'll get this, this will take typically 2 to 3 months, or 12 to 18 months, or a week, or whatever it is. And then some sort of schedule, like maybe we're, as part of our response, we assume that we're going to start this thing in June, or we're going to start this by April, or whatever. In particular, that kind of information is very important because a lot of times that allows the respondents to give you some information like, by the way, we are available right now, but if you wait 3 months, we have a whole bunch of projects and we're not going to be able to fit you in. There's things like that that can come up, and it's important to ask for those up front. Don't be afraid to ask about, and it's definitely this is one of the areas that I think a lot of people have sort of forget, or they don't spend as much time thinking about it as they should. And that's SLA, service level agreements, and support. Like, hey, once you've given me the solution, what happens after that? Once it's in, do I never see you again? Do you have some sort of guarantees? If so, what are those guarantees? Is this do I get the 6 nines, 99.9999 uptime? If it's not up, is there any penalties? Does that mean I get like a discount? All of that kind of stuff. Support, is this something where part of this proposal, are you assuming that I'm going to call X amount of times? Do I get one support incident a month? Do I just pay for support incidents? Do I get free support? Sort of as a part of that is, what kind of training and documentation is there? Do I get some with it? Are you going to walk me through, for example, like an install, which, larger systems, you may have that, or even software as a service. There's sometimes not really an install as much as like set up an initial configuration. There may be data imports and stuff like that. Well, part of the proposal, should be what's included. Am I going to be paying? Do I have like an install cost or a startup cost that I have to fee, or startup fees that I have to pay? Is there technical documentation? Is there user guides? Is there an online community? Is there training that's either included? Is it for users or administrators? Are there training programs available? What kind of costs are available there or associated with that? All of that kind of good stuff. And then, of course, getting into the meat of the response is things like, hey, if you're giving me a solution, provide me some architectural information about this, like in the platform. What kind of language is this in? What kind of database do you have in the back end? What kind of backups do you do? Do you have disaster recovery? Have you gone through security audits? Is this, can you provide me maybe your back end, some architecture diagrams or something, so I can look at it and realize that, yes, this is a solid architecture, or, oh my gosh, this is a house of cards that's going to fall apart any day now. From the business side of it, is things like the financials. Who are the key management people that are going to be involved? In particular, what are the people that I should expect that are going to be, what's the structure of the solution you're providing me? So if you're going to come in and customize a solution for me, should I expect that you're going to provide a project manager, a designer, testers, things like that? I mean, developers probably are always going to show up in these kind of things, but maybe not. So what's going to be involved with that? And then, of course, recent history of the company itself. Again, like I said, if you recently been acquired or merged or come out of bankruptcy or changed your name, or just all the things that can happen in a business, because that can be very important. There have been cases where I've looked at something that's like, wow, that's an awesome product, until I realize that it's actually a product that's untried, even though the company may be 20 years old, but you look at it and realize that they just launched into this whole new business and product 12 months ago. So you're actually, one of a couple of customers, and all of the other customers they list are for some other product that maybe even completely unrelated to what you do. Once you have the responses in, and actually you don't even have to wait till the responses to come in, you want to build a scorecard. And actually I've found it's very useful to do this, building out your scorecard, at least what the format of it, the template of it, doing this while you're building the RFP, because really the two should work hand in glove. You should have that the RFP, the responses and or at least the expected responses in their format should be in such a way that it's easy for you to plug information into your scorecard. And with the scorecard, what this is really what you're going to go through is it's to give you a way to do apples to apples comparison across your responses. So go through the key areas where you're going to evaluate it, which is, first thing is going to be your requirements. Is, do they meet, if I've got 10 requirements, those should be 10 items in my scorecard, basically. Is so I can say, do they meet this? And if so, to what level? Now, when I talk about scorecard, I do want to say that it doesn't necessarily have to be hard numbers. So it's not like you need to have every value is going to be 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, and then you're going to add them all up. If you can do that, awesome. But a lot of times you can't. There's things like, do they do backup, which is really more a binary. It's like yes or no, or do they provide support? Yes, no, yes, but it's paid. There's some things like that you may be able to put numbers to all of it, but it's almost more trouble than it's worth. And instead, what you want from your scorecard is a way to really scan across. If you can use some numerical ones, great, because that gives you an ability to at least have a number or two, some metrics to work with. But you're probably going to have a lot of non-numeric stuff as well. That's almost like the comparison charts you often see for products out on a website, where you see, it's like, our product has, we have all these little check marks down there, and the competitor products have all these check marks, but look, they're missing some check marks. That's essentially what you want to build in your scorecard. So it may be more complicated than just, checking or not checking a box, but honestly, if you could get the scorecard down to that would be a pretty good way to do some comparisons, because then you could just count the number of checks at the end. Don't be afraid, and once you've got your scorecard, don't be afraid to go in and do a little pre-response research, because that's going to help you out and also help you with the vetting. So by that, you can go through, you can go use Glassdoor and some of those kind of places. You can figure out what are the, maybe last year, what are the sales numbers for this company? What are the number of employees that they have? What are the number of customers they have? Sometimes you can find stuff like, what's the breakdown of their customers? How many of their customers are within your industry versus how many are in other industries? Which is, one of those things as part of those questions, sort of as a flashback there to some of the questions you can ask is, hey, what industry do you typically work in? Maybe it's not ours. Maybe we're a nonprofit and you've never dealt with a nonprofit before. And we look at it as, we have some different problems to solve. There's some different issues and context around our problem. So you can look into this stuff. You can potentially find a lot of the information about the requirements, and probably should have actually as part of this process. So we'll talk about this in a minute. Should have done a little bit of this research so you have at least an idea of what the responses are going to look like, as far as roughly what some of that scorecard is going to look like for the various vendors. And the more you can fill that out, the better, because then what you'll do is you'll go look at their response and you'll be able to one, you'll already have that data, but two, you'll be able to see, is my data a match for what they've responded with? Maybe that your data is out of sync or older data, but if nothing else, that's a very important thing to, if you're not sure, don't be afraid to ask them and say, hey, I was doing some research and I found that your sales number said this, but you send me this other number. Can you explain the difference between the two? And it may be something simple like it's old, and it may be something more complex like, oh, well, we actually include all of these other numbers in our sales numbers that this other thing doesn't. And, so it may be something where you find out that somebody's there's sort of they've got some marketing involved in some of that data that, you really want to remove that so that you can deal with reality and not just marketing and smoke and mirror stuff. With your scorecard, make sure it's not, like I said, it would be sort of nice. In many ways, it would be nice. It's just a bunch of numbers. You can add it up. And then at the end of the day, whoever's got the best score, you go with it. But that's not really the way it typically goes. And it doesn't, I don't know if I've ever found a situation where that works. So make sure that you've got, with your scorecard, you're taking notes along the way, that you've got some details about likes and dislikes about the respondents, and maybe some additional information that you didn't include in requirements, you didn't include in the nice to haves, but as you're talking to them, it's like, oh, wow, they do this other thing. And these are the kinds of things that could turn out to be the icing on the cake that make you select a specific vendor. For example, you may be driven to solve one specific problem, or tightly focused problem. Well, the respondents may have more problems that they solve. For example, you may have, like we ran into this, is that we were doing an RFP for really for a search product to go on top of a website. Well, some of these, some of the respondents had just a straight up search product, but then others had a lot of like Google SEO, search engine optimization kind of pieces that they included in, some additional marketing stuff that they did, and way to build and drive marketing campaigns and ad campaigns, and even response campaigns back to customers, like abandoned cart stuff and things like that, that was way beyond what we were looking at, but it was things that we were looking at further down the road. So it's one of those where you have an opportunity where you say, oh, well, we hadn't actually thought about this problem yet, but because you solve it, that makes you a more likely direction to go, because then we don't have to essentially do this again. We know that you can help us out down the road. So as I sort of implied already, is you need to vet the responses. It may sound like I'm down on the responses or something like that, because I talk about them putting some marketing speech and things like that in, and I don't mean it that way. It's making sure, although that is occasionally the case, more often than not, the thing is there's opportunities to clarify, and that's on both sides, and plus, for yourself, if you're going through an RFP process, you can learn a lot about your problem, about how the industry sees it, and about the solutions out there going through this process. There's a lot of times I've gone through it and we've actually learned as we've gone, because there's features and approaches that we hadn't even considered that it's like, oh, wow, this is out there. So we want, suddenly it's like, oh, heck, we gotta get some of that. That's an awesome little piece we hadn't thought of, but that went from, we don't even know that exists, to, wow, that's actually a requirement, and things like that. So make sure that you schedule demos, that you actually, have them walk you through the solution to some extent, or at least, conference calls or something like that, where you can walk through what they're proposing. It's essentially like a vendor interview. It's like, okay, you've provided this, you're proposing this solution. Well, walk me through that. How's that going to work? Allow them to better understand your business and what you're looking for. And of course, you want to understand better their solution and what they're going to provide for you. And you can always consider that it could be useful to have a proof of concept. That may be something that that's going to be very important, is that maybe you're doing something that's a little more cutting edge, or you haven't ever really seen the solution that works right, or the vendors, it's like, well, this could be a good vendor, but I'm not convinced that they really can solve the problem the way I need them to solve it. So whether you're, maybe utilize like trials, or, if they've got some sandbox setup that you can work with, that you can go in and, do the proof of concept yourself. Or, sometimes that's something that they'll do where you can say, hey, I'm not 100% this works in my case. So how about I give you, maybe some of my sample data or a couple of key things, and see if you can get somebody on your end to actually build a, at least mock up some sort of solution enough that I'm comfortable that you can do this. Take advantage of this stuff too, because these guys are selling to you, so you may be able to get essentially a little free work out of it. And with all of this too, you're going to be able to get a better idea of scope of some of these solutions. So you'll know if you have like a couple of critical things that are on your requirements list, and you go through the proof of concept and it takes them 2 weeks to do it, then okay, if we're going to have to do this thing, at least we can, it help us through a little time. We know it's going to take us probably 2 or 3 weeks at least to get that done. And now that we've gone through all this, we get to the making selection part. Well, as I said, the scorecard is great. It's going to be a good way for you to compare apples to apples. But take a look at it and rank the responses. Sometimes you'll find that there's stuff that, particularly if you have a long scorecard, I've run into this where there's a vendor that I think is really like top notch. That's, they're like, oh yeah, we're going to go that way. And you look at the scorecard and you realize they're like at the bottom, or towards the bottom. So there's biases, personality biases, presentation biases, things like that may, it's good to have that scorecard, because it's basically going to help you back up your decision, or help you question your decision. When you look at it, you say, well, man, I really like this group, but as I look at it, they actually don't provide practically anything compared to the other solutions that are out there that have been proposed. As much as possible, make sure that you filled out that scorecard, so that you do understand the details behind those items. Costs and features are often a case where there may be some hidden licensing fees, or recurring prices, or support costs, or change request costs, or things like that that could factor in highly into what the solution is. So, make sure you've walked through that, you really understand, you're clear on what has been proposed. Hopefully, when you get done, the clear winner is easy. I just went through this in a process where we got it down to a short list of 3. 2 of them were like mirror images of each other in a sense. And then the third one was like about the same, but like half the cost or something like that. It was enough that it was like, okay, all things being equal, these guys are half the cost. That's a pretty good discount, so we're going to go that route. But sometimes that's not the case. More often, you're going to have 1 or 2 that are probably going to be really close, and then a bunch you can throw out. So once you get to that really short list, that's where you can basically try to get a little bidding war in. Maybe you push the proof of concept between those and say, hey, whoever can get me a proof of concept faster or better, that's sort of the way I'm going. And be honest with them. Say, hey, you're down to 2 or 3 people, and this is what I'm doing to help me decide. You may also go ahead and say, hey, look, got 2 really good bids. I like both of you. I'm really happy. Do a little negotiating. Say, hey, what's your best number? Maybe you gave me your best bid before, but now give me your better best bid. Something like that. It's like, hey, if I'm, you're neck and neck with this competitor, what are you willing to do to win my business? So you can, and you could use that even if you get down to 1, but usually if you get down to 1, they're probably a big enough, big enough win that just go to some other negotiating strategies if you want to try to get the best deal out of it. But trying to play them against somebody else when that other company isn't in the running anymore can actually confuse things, because what can happen is you can say, oh, it's you and this other company, and they, especially if you mention who the other company is, then suddenly they're like, wait a minute, that other company does stuff very differently. So what are we missing? So you might start wasting their time, essentially. We're trying to second guess themselves on what they're actually providing. So to get to it, looking back at the process is basically, an RFP process. You start out by defining your requirements or your needs, research your potential solutions, try to get yourself down to some short or target list of vendors, create your RFP document, set up, there's going to be some period of, response period where you're talking to vendors, you're clarifying things, you're going through demos with them. And then once you've wrapped that up, give yourself a hard deadline, and then, look at the score and the selection. And this should be, the scoring and selection, try to keep that pretty quick because you've got these vendors, hanging out and waiting on your response, essentially. They put time into it, so respect that and, let them know when you will give them an answer of some sort. So final thoughts. This is actually a very valuable process. You can learn a lot about your problem. You can learn a lot about the solutions that are out there. Even if it ends up something where you go through an RFP and it's actually we're going to do it ourselves, there's a lot you can learn from it, which makes it, as I said, very valuable. Don't be afraid to ask for details. These people are, although you're letting people know that you are available to be sold to, they're still going to be, they still have it on their side to sell to you. So don't be afraid to get as much details as possible to make sure that you have the information you need to make the correct decision, or at least the best decision based on your knowledge. I expect this process to take weeks, not days. You cannot, I've seen this a few times where people try to blast through an RFP process. They start on Monday and they want the solution. They want to have the selection by Friday. If you short circuit it, you're short circuiting yourself. Expect that it's going to take time to craft, get your good requirements together, putting it in an RFP document, sending that out, giving those vendors time to give a valid response, and walk through that process. If you put a real complicated RFP together and you've got a deadline of, hey, we're going to try to have all this done and get the response done in 2 days, the vendor's going to look back and say no. If they even come back, they may think that you're just a complete fool and they're not even going to bother with you. So make sure that you think this thing through and respect the fact that it's going to, if you want them to give you a good response, you're going to have to give them some time to put together a good response, particularly if it's a customized one. And if they don't respond back to you, you can always do some follow-ups and things like that to make sure mails weren't lost or people weren't on vacation. But if they don't respond, a non-response is, just, okay, we're not going to talk to you guys. If they're not going to respond to the RFP, then, why bother with them anymore? If they think they're too good for you, then say, yes, you are too good for me. We don't need you. That wraps this one up. Once again, as always, I appreciate your time and attention to this. You can send questions, comments, and suggestions to email. You can contact form on the website. You can follow us on Twitter at RBC Posts. Just, however you want to do it. Questions, comments,